Well, good evening. My name is Evan Gregory, and this is Bible Answers. We are continuing our study in the book of Colossians. We're looking at chapter 2, ending chapter 2 rather tonight. We're beginning in verse 11. And this is brought to you by the North Columbus Church of Christ. We are located in Columbus, Mississippi. You can see our website scrolling below me. That's northcolumbuschristians.com. And we'd love to hear any comments or questions you might have. So feel free to leave those here. Also, we put these up on our YouTube page. It's North Columbus Church of Christ, and you can find that and subscribe to that page, and you'll be able to see when we upload these same videos. If you would like to watch any videos you might have missed, or you might want to share it with anybody, that will be. I think that it's a better way to do so through YouTube. But anyways, we're looking at Colossians 2. We're going to be finishing that chapter up tonight. We looked at verses 1 through 10. I believe it was 2 weeks ago, and we're going to be beginning in verse 11. And just kind of a recap, if I can get my slides to working. Again, we see Paul writing to the Colossians, and he's emphasizing, again, their zeal that they've had, but also wanting them to continue to grow. Again, in verse 1 of chapter 2 and beginning through 3, he says that, for as many as not seen my face, he wants them for their hearts to be encouraged, being knit together in love, attaining to all the riches of the full assurance of understanding. So that's growing in love, growing in knowledge of Christ as well. And, we see that same idea in chapter 1 too. And so, beginning in verse 11, he starts talking about this idea of circumcision. And if you're not familiar with what Paul is talking about, this is very common in Judaism, the old law. And what we see here is that it's pretty evident that those in Colossae were having some issue in Acts chapter 15, Galatians, book of Hebrews as well. It seems that either Jewish Christians and even Gentile Christians had a lot of issues with whether or not they should hold to certain parts of the old law, or whether or not in Acts chapter 15, there were some that saying that one had to be circumcised in order to be saved. And there was others, it seemed to some degree that they were talking about either being circumcised or hold to at least some parts of the old law, that basically they need to become really kind of good Jews in order to be Christians. And this is the kind of context I think is pretty obvious in which Paul is talking about here, that there was probably some individual saying, well, perhaps you need to be circumcised. These Gentiles need to be circumcised in order to become Christians, when in reality the New Testament makes no such demand. Beginning in verse 11, he says, in him you were also circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the sins of the flesh, by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, in which you also were raised with him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. And you, being dead in your trespasses and uncircumcision of your flesh, he has made alive together with him, have forgiven you all trespasses, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross, having disarmed principalities and powers, he has made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. So, if you kind of think about what possibly could be going on, you have some saying, well, you need to be circumcised in order to be or continue to be a Christian. And Paul makes the argument, well, you are already circumcised, but not just circumcision according to the Jewish law. He says you were circumcised with the circumcision made without hands. So this is something different. This is not some type of physical circumcision. This is spiritual in nature, all right? And so you have been circumcised, which, again, I should have probably talked about this earlier, but it was a sign of the covenant. It was covenant that was made to Abraham. His offspring would be circumcised. We see it throughout his lineage others were circumcised as well. But Paul makes the argument here again that they were already circumcised. So something has already been done. A covenant has already been made here, but it's without hands by putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ. All right. So this is the key here, that this circumcision puts off the body of the sins of the flesh. So you're putting off the old man by the circumcision of Christ. And so we may start thinking, well, what is that circumcision of Christ? Is that something special? Is this some type of spiritual experience? But Paul says that going on, he says, buried with him in baptism, in which you also were raised with him through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead. So Paul here is linking the circumcision of Christ with baptism. And this is baptism means immersion. So this would be, if we look throughout the New Testament's baptism, this is immersion in water. And so you're buried with him. You're buried with Christ in this baptism. And he says you're buried, but now you're raised with him. Romans 6 also talks about this, that you're buried with Christ in baptism. You're raised to walk in newness of life. Here, you're raised with him. How? You're through faith in the working of God. It's very interesting when you start talking about this idea of baptism and what it means and what it does, and is it necessary or not. Many of those that would hold to this idea that baptism is not necessary will say, well, this is just some type of work. New Testament makes it clear that works are not necessary for salvation. Well, Paul kind of contradicts this idea here, because he's saying in this baptism that it is you're raised with him through faith in the working of God. So this baptism is an act of faith, all right? That through that, God is working, all right? And you have faith in that working. And what is that working? Well, it's the putting off of the body, putting off the sins of the flesh, putting off the old man. And again, he emphasizes this in the next sentence. He says, and you being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he has made alive together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses. So previously, you were in the uncircumcision of your flesh. You're dead in your trespasses. Now you received the circumcision, putting off the body of the sins of the flesh. How? Being buried with him in baptism, raised through faith in the working of God. Again, Romans 6 talks about you are raised to walk in newness of life. Again, think about that in context of here, that you are a new creation now. In Galatians 3, verses 26 and 27, talks about you're all sons of God. How? Through faith. But for all have been baptized have put on Christ. That's verse 27. So there, verses 26 and 27, we see faith and baptism being enjoined as well, just like we see here in Colossians chapter 2. And so through that, you put off the sins of the flesh. You have been made alive together with him. You have been forgiven all your trespasses. And then it continues on. It says, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us. What is that handwriting here? And I think this is, again, that we have to look at the New Testament, look at a lot of Paul's writings to kind of understand what this is. And just like with this idea of circumcision, he's talking about the old law here, that this is the handwriting of requirements that was against us. So why it was against us? Well, through the law, there was knowledge of sins. And also the Hebrew writer points out that those animal sacrifices in the old law was just not enough. That those sins were looked over, but they were not completely atoned for. They can only be atoned for through Christ. And so in that way, that handwriting, that law was against us. There had to be something else. But notice he says, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. Interesting enough, there's a lot of people that would consider themselves to be Christians that still would say, well, we need to hold to certain parts of the old law. Maybe we need to keep the Sabbath. Maybe we need to, maybe we need to hold to some of the restrictions on diet. Maybe eat certain types of food. And there's some that maybe when there's some type of argument being made, someone who's not a Christian say, well, if you say you need to do this, well, you have to keep the entirety of the old law, which you're not doing, and use that as an excuse to get away with committing some type of sin today. And the reality is, it shows that they don't really understand what's being taught in the New Testament. The writers of the New Testament make it very clear that through the new covenant established by Christ, one is no longer bound to the old law. You don't have to keep any parts of the old law. And of course, I think we recognize that there are parts of the new that bring over some elements of the old law, but the old law in and of itself, we're not beholden to. That's not our standard anymore. And he makes it clear here. He says that handwriting was nailed to the cross. It's done. It's dead. We no longer have to follow it. And he says, also having disarmed principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in him. When you think about, he's triumphed over those that would want to put him to death, the Jews who were over him, even some of the greatness of the Roman Empire. You might think about that. Satan, he's triumphed over all of them. And, really the gospel was moving and throughout the whole world, even when those that are of the world were working against it the entire time. Moving on to verses 16 through 19, it says, so let no one judge you in food or in drink or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substances of Christ. Let no one cheat you in your reward, taking delight in false humility and worship of angels, intruding into those things which is not seen, vainly puffed up by his fleshly mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom all the body, nourished and knit together by joints and ligaments, grow with increase that is from God. Again, Paul is continuing with this idea of those that might say one had to follow the old law. And he's saying, let no one judge you in those things. The festival, the new moon or Sabbath, those are all special days to the Jews. They were no longer to follow that. But he says these things are a shadow of things to come. If you read, I know I reference Hebrews a lot. If you read throughout Hebrews, the writer makes a case of that all these elements of the old law, you think about the sacrifices, the tabernacle, all of those instruments, that they were necessary at the time, but they were a shadow of the things to come, that they were a type, but the truth was going to come, and that was going to come through Christ. I think this is the same message that's being brought, that it's not that the old law was just completely unnecessary and that a Christian should not ever read and understand those things of the old law. I think those are very important and we should read those things, but make the connection that points to something greater, that they give us that they're written, all those things are written so we can see the examples. We definitely see plenty of examples of what not to do and what to do, but also all the things in there according to the law, the worship there as well. And it's pointing to something greater, and that is in Christ. The substance is of Christ. The true things was brought through by Christ. And then he continues on, and he starts talking about this false humility, worship of angels. I don't know exactly what this whole idea of worship of angels is. I think it seems as though the Jews kind of had, I don't know if we'd say, I guess you would say, a fascination with angels. Again, I reference Hebrews chapter 1, the writer making the argument of that Christ is greater than the angels. So it seems as though there were some who held angels to some great esteem, to the point where possibly, I guess it would have been worship. But these people are taking delight in these things, and he's saying, don't get involved with this. that they are vainly puffed up by their fleshly minds. That this is the true reality. They may seem as humble individuals, they may seem like nice individuals, but this is the reality. They're puffed up. They have a fleshly mind. They're not holding fast to the head, which is Christ. All right, and if you're not holding fast to the head, well, there's nothing. There's no hope really for you. As Galatians 1 talks about, those that teach a false teaching or a false doctrine, they are to be accursed. So at that point, there's no hope for you, and those Christians ought not to be caught up listening to those false teachers as well. Also, verses 20 through 23. It says, therefore, if you died with Christ from the basic principles of the world, why, as though living in the world, do you subject yourself to regulations? Do not touch, do not taste, do not handle, which all concern things which perish with the using, according to the commandments and doctrines of men. These things indeed have an appearance of wisdom and self-imposed religion, false humility, neglect of the body, but of no value against the indulgence of the flesh. So, harking back to verses 11 and 12, Paul says, you have died with Christ from the basic principles of the world. Well, how? Well, your old man died. You were buried with Christ in baptism, and now you are raised up. All right. So you have died to those old things. Now you're raised to walk in newness of life. And so why do you go back to these former things, subjecting yourself to these regulations that are not necessary? You think about the issues that the Jews, specifically the Pharisees, the Sadducees, had with Jesus about, well, he's not washing or he's not doing this correctly or so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, those ideas about certain washings of that nature, those were all made up in the minds of men. This was not something that was necessary for one to hold to according to the old law. And this is possibly what is being referenced here with this idea of don't touch, don't taste, don't handle. Again, this could reference other parts of the actual parts of the old law with the diet restrictions as well. But Paul here, he's saying that these are the commandments and doctrines of men. And what we have to realize is, again, that old law was nailed to the cross. It had its purpose. But now that Christ has come, the new covenant established, those things are, they have their purpose, they have their use, but now we're on to something new. And to hold to that, to continue to follow those old things, well, that's not from God. That's from man. And those that are still necessitating that one holds to the old law, well, that's of the mind of man, that's a doctrine of man, that's a commandment to man. And Paul is urging them again to don't get caught up in this, don't follow these teachings. And again, he says these things look good, they have an appearance of wisdom. We have this humility, neglect of the body, but it says, but they are of no value against the indulgence of the flesh. Again, they may look the part, but at the end of the day, we have to look at what they're teaching and how does that stand up in light of what has now been brought forth through Christ. If it doesn't match up, it doesn't matter what they're doing. We shouldn't be following that. And so this ends chapter 2. We'll be looking at chapter 3, Lord willing, next Sunday. And again, if you have a question or comment, feel free to leave that. I will try to answer those. And also our YouTube, if you leave a comment, I'll try to answer those as well. But again, we're going to continue study through the book of Colossians. We're looking at chapter 3, and we're just going to slowly make our way through the book. Thanks.